Recording.
Welcome to another edition of Consciousness Hour. Myself and Dia are having a series of Archon incidents regarding this particular interview, but we are persevering. Our guest has, for some reason, our guest's camcorder is not working. Camera is not working properly on his computer, which is a bit sad. But we'll still be go ahead with non-visuals and sound only. Right, just a little bit of background. Around about 14 years ago, I was doing a business contract in the beautiful West Country town of Bath over here in the UK. And as is my way, I tend to check out bookshops. And I found a wonderful bookshop, and I'm a strong believer in the Jungian concept of the library angel. And I tend to find that if I just go into a bookshop, I will tend to find books that I really want or need, or even subliminally need. I might even necessarily be aware of the fact I need them. And this was the case this time. At that stage, I was finishing the research on my first book, Is There Life After Death? And I went into the bookshop and I picked up one or two books that were relevant to the work I was doing. But there was one book that particularly caught my attention. And I picked it up, and it was this book called Extraordinary People, written by a gentleman called Darold Treffert, who is a psychiatrist based in Fond du Lac over in the United States. Now, Darold, from starting reading the book, I discovered that Darold is probably reasonably recognized as being the world's leading authority on Savant Syndrome. That is the subject we discussed with Diane Hennessy-Powell in the last edition of this podcast. And it's to do with individuals who seem to be utterly talented in terms of they have issues in their lives in terms of some neurological issues or learning additions, but they seem to be compensated in other ways. And Darold has written a series of books on this subject, as well as Extraordinary People Understanding Savant Syndrome. He's also written a book called Islands of Genius, The Bountiful Mind of the Autistic, Acquired and Sudden Savant, which, interestingly enough, Darold and I, with some of our books, share a publisher, which is Jessica Kingsley over here in the UK. Now, I've been keen to talk to Darold for so long, and I have read Extraordinary People probably 5 or 6 times, and this summer I read it again in greater detail in research for my forthcoming book, Opening the Doors of Perception, because there are so many questions I have of this man. Darold was also the technical expert on the movie Rain Man with Dustin Hoffman and Tom Cruise, and worked for a great deal of his time with the Salt Lake City-based savant Peake, sort of a homonym of my own surname. I'm hoping that we'll be able to chat in greater detail about his work there. So without further ado, Darold, are you still there with us?
I'm here. I'm glad to be with you today.
Wonderful. I mean, you have been one of my intellectual heroes for so long, and the opportunity to speak to you here is just, I'm just in awe of your work. I can't even begin to say how wonderful I find your work. So what I'd like to do then, as we do with most of our guests, if you can give us a little bit of background detail as to how you became involved in your interest in Savant Syndrome, what it was that stimulated it, and just tell us a little bit about yourself, really.
Sure. I went to medical school at the University of Wisconsin in Madison, and then completed a psychiatric residency program at University Hospitals in Madison. And when I completed that, I was assigned the responsibility of starting a children's unit at a psychiatric hospital here in Wisconsin. There were about 800 patients at the hospital, and about 25 of those were under 18. And so it was decided that we should put those into a separate unit and start a children's unit. That was in 1962. So I gathered together these 25 autistic patients, and 3 of them particularly caught my eye. One lad had memorized the bus system of the city of Milwaukee, and if you told him the time of day and the corner, he'd tell you the bus number that's passing by there just then. We had another little fellow who was mute and very disabled, and yet you could put a 250-piece jigsaw puzzle in front of him with the picture side down, and he would put it together just from the geometric shapes. And we had a third little fellow who was a walking almanac on what happened in this day in history. And every morning I'd come on the unit, he would say, Dr. Treffert, do you know what happened on this day in history? And I tried to bone up the night before. And of course, that was before Google, so I had to use the encyclopedia, and I could never outdo him. So I became interested in this situation where people had this severe disability, but had this island of ability that stood in stark contrast. And the contrast of the ability with this disability just really caught my eye. And I wondered, what does that say about Savant Syndrome? And more importantly, what does it say about the potential perhaps in all of us? At that time, the condition was called the idiot savant. And because in 1887, Dr. J. Langdon Down in England at the Earlswood Asylum gave a lecture to his colleagues and said, now I've spent my whole career at the Earlswood here, and I want to tell you about some cases. And see, he described what became known as Down syndrome, but he also described in his lecture, he said, now I've got 10 patients that I want to tell you about. And he said, these are people who had disabilities, but one little fellow, we could take him to the opera, and he'd come home and he'd sing the arias perfectly, just having heard them one time. And he described 10 cases of this situation. At that time, the term idiot was a scientific accepted term for an IQ below 25. And savant came from a French word meaning to know. And so he put those two words together, called the idiot savant, which was a colorful term at that time, but of course is one which fell into disrepute. And so in 1980, in an article, I suggested that we put that term aside and call it Savant Syndrome. So I began to do some research on that condition and found at that time that there was maybe fewer than 100 cases in the whole world literature of the savant, and began to do my investigation. I went on to become director of the hospital, so I had other things to tend to than the children's unit. But in June of 1980, Leslie Lemke came to Fond du Lac to give a concert. Leslie Lemke was blind. He's developmentally disabled, and also has a cerebral palsy that he cannot hold a fork or spoon to eat. And yet, when he sits down at the piano, that disappears, and he plays marvelously. And the story there is that May Lemke, who's from England, was a governess here in Wisconsin. And Leslie was sent home to die because he was very sick after his early months. And she said, you can send him here, but he's not going to die. And she tutored him and took him under her wing. And he had no music lessons at all. But when he was about 14 years old, one night they watched a movie on television. Leslie listened, of course, because he's blind. And it was a movie called Sincerely Yours. And in it, the theme song is Tchaikovsky's First Piano Concerto. And they went to bed, and about 2 a.m, May woke up, and she said she heard some music, and she thought maybe they had left the television on, so she went, and there was Leslie playing Tchaikovsky's First Piano Concerto from beginning to end, having heard it one time flawlessly. And he then came to Fond du Lac to give a concert in June of 1980, and the local television people brought the tapes to me because they didn't believe what they saw in this lad who's so disabled and yet has this musical genius. And they asked me, well, what is it? And I said, well, it's something called the Savant Syndrome. It was picked up by the news wire, the AP wire, and that story that Christmas became Walter Cronkite's Christmas story about May and her child. And he became sort of an instant celebrity. That was before the days of YouTube, by the way, but somehow that story got around. And then watching that program was Dustin Hoffman. And Dustin Hoffman said he was moved to tears by this lad with his disability and this incredible ability. He decided there that he would play the savant in the movie Rain Man. Rain Man came out in 1989, and of course that made the term autistic savant sort of a household term, and that just increased the cases coming to my attention, and I've just concentrated on those since that time.
Just a very quick question, just to clarify in my own mind. The case of Leslie absolutely intrigues me because, as I understand it, he had no musical training and had presumably a piano was something he would only know by touch, and yet he was able to reproduce knowing where the keys were and knowing how to play the keys as well. Am I right in saying that?
Yes, well, actually, May got him a piano when he was maybe about a little piano when he was about 7 or 8 years old, and she played the piano herself, and so she would put his hands on hers, and she would play these simple little Irish tunes and so forth. So that was the extent of any knowledge. But interestingly, I was with him one time. We were giving a concert. He was giving a concert at a school, and we were in the band room waiting for this to start. And there was a marimba or a xylophone in there. And Leslie had never been exposed to a marimba or a xylophone, and so we brought it over to him, and he just felt it. He touched it and touched it and touched it for a while, and then we gave him the mallets, and then he began to play the xylophone. And so it just intuitively or instinctively was able to know how to do that.
What this suggests, doesn't it, is that he had an ability to memorize. I mean, one could argue that it was a kind of photographic memory, but because he was blind, one can't use the argument of photographic memory. It was a kind of a nodidetic memory. This was something where he was able to effectively remember and reproduce a whole piece of music, not a theme, not a tune, but the whole piece of music, which is incredible, isn't it?
It is, except it is incredible, but it's a quality that almost all savants have. Savants have various abilities, and typically it's music, art, mathematics, calendar calculating, or other kinds of lightning calculating. But whatever the skill, it's always coupled with this what I call massive memory. But it's a memory that's very, very deep, but very, very narrow. But it is it's a characteristic of all of the savants, so that the artist can look at a scene just once and then reproduce it. Stephen Wilshire, that lives in London, can go over Rome for 45 minutes in a helicopter and then spend the next 3 days drawing what he saw brick by brick and window by window. And it's so that kind of memory is characteristic of all of the savants.
Well, funnily enough, this afternoon I was doing research on another subject, and I came across, quite again serendipitously, one of Stephen Wilshire's drawings of London from the helicopter. And I was simply staggered that somebody from seeing something for such a short period of time could draw something with such uncanny detail. And I'm talking about the detail even to the number of windows in buildings right across London. You know, it was a vista taken around about, 200 feet above the Houses of Parliament. And you could see the river, and you could see the London Eye and everything. But this was startling in its power and its intensity. So clearly we have something that certain individuals have, where they can actually memorize and bring things up. Now, there's a question I want to ask you that will be slightly technical for the listeners, but it is of great importance to me. In your book, you quoted the Hamburger and Oppenheim work from 1982 about the massive cell death before birth, and the idea that somewhere in the region, I think it was somewhere in the region of 80% neurons are effectively killed off in the last month of gestation. Now, is that still the case? Has there been any more research done on this? Because it's something I want to actually expand upon in my own book. So do you have any more information on that? Because particularly for personal reasons, because my mother had toxemia, and I was born 5 weeks premature. I had to be Caesared. So effectively, if there is this massive cell death, I would have missed out on that cell death in exactly the same way as autistic savants do. And I have a reputation for having quite a peculiar memory and quite a peculiar ability to actually call facts and figures. So I was just wondering, has there been any more work done on that?
Well, I think the massive cell die-off has been confirmed and replicated by many studies. So I think that phenomena is one which is generally accepted.
And so what does that tell us then? I know, because I'm aware of it, but for our listeners to know a little bit more about this, what are the implications there for Savant Syndrome? What is it telling us? Because I'm intrigued, because I've just finished doing a contract with a school that has children with temporal lobe epilepsy and also autism of various kinds. And one of the things I noticed that statistically, the number of individuals who have autism who are born premature more than 4 or 5 weeks is highly high. So this whole theory of the testosterone thing and everything else really links in some way. So I'm interested in your opinion and your thoughts on this, because I know you've touched upon it in your books.
Well, I also was struck by the number of premature births in the autistic, and particularly the Savant Syndrome group. Especially the musician group, such as Leslie, who actually developed a blindness from the prematurity. It's called a retinopathy of prematurity. And so many of the savants, the musical savants, are blind, and that has to do with their blindness, not in terms of producing the blindness, but also, I think, making a special case with respect to memory before there is that massive cell die-off. And interestingly, so many of the musical savants were born in the 50s, when we were giving 100% oxygen to premature babies to preserve their life, and that produced this retinopathy, and also produced, I think, a similar change in the brain itself from the excess oxygen. And so there is this group of savants, musical savants, in the 50s. Then we stopped that excess oxygen, so we didn't see as much blindness of prematurity, and we didn't see as many musical savants. But now we're seeing that again, because so many births are premature and such tiny babies that in order for them to survive, they have to have oxygen, and this is done with consent, recognizing blindness may result, but the parents choose to go ahead. So we're beginning to see some of those savants again, with the triad of musical genius, autism, and blindness. So I think I think that's to be explored and to be implicated in Savant Syndrome.
Yeah, because it is fascinating, this, isn't it? Because the way in which, trying to actually isolate the causes of Savant Syndrome and what it is neurologically that's taking place at the time. Now, one of the other things that, again, I would love to talk to you about and know a little bit more about is there was something I read which I thought was fascinating, was to do with the work of Bernard Rimland and the evidence he had And I know that you touch upon this in your writing as well, the way in which certain autistic individuals seem to have skills that are over and above skills that can be necessarily explained using the present scientific paradigm. Now, Diane Hennessy Powell and myself discussed this last month, but you are the guy that originally referenced the young lady who shows the telepathic mathematical knowledge to Diane, as I recall. What is your opinions on this? Do you think that we're joining too many dots here, or do you think there is something here that may be worth pursuing?
Well, yeah, I think there is something here which is worth pursuing, and I didn't start with that idea. My journey with savants has taken me into areas that I probably would not have otherwise ventured into. And one of those is this, there are really two things. We can talk about each of them maybe. One is that it has been so impressive to me how savants know things they never learned. They know music, they know art, they know mathematics, and they've never learned that. And so, and I see that over and over and over again, and that's something which drew me then into what I call genetic memory, and that whole area is an area I otherwise wouldn't have ventured into. But also, I have come across several cases. Well, starting with Bernie Rimland back in 1943, he did a survey of 5,340 parents, a very extensive questionnaire. Bernie was very compulsive about his questionnaire, so it was a very lengthy questionnaire. And what he found was that about 1 out of 10 parents of autistic kids said that their child had some special skills, and art, music, and math generally. But 1% of those, less than about 1% of those indicated that their child had some ESP or telepathy or paranormal abilities. And when I was reviewing his work, I simply reported in that 1980 study, I said that Dr. Rimland reported that a certain percent of these autistic individuals had paranormal or ESP abilities. And I got sort of excoriated in the literature for even reporting that he had reported that. And that's all I was doing. And so I set that aside, and then we just completed, in fact, just published yesterday, was an article on which our preliminary report on our autistic registry, in which we are looking at 317 cases of Savant Syndrome, and about 1% of those, there is this report of paranormal, telepathy, or ESP abilities. So my work sort of very much confirms what Rimland said. And then I came across, about a year ago, the case of Nandana, this girl in India who was reportedly reading her mother's mind. And in other words, what her mother would think, and Nandana would write that out. And she's autistic, and she was using the typing tablet. And there was a good deal of publicity about Nandana. And in fact, they took her to a clinic where they live, and the clinic confirmed, at least to their satisfaction, that indeed this was happening. I then lost track of the case, and I don't know what happened, but I haven't had any follow-up with her. And I think what happened is that the media probably descended on the family in such a way as they just decided to not share anything further, because I was corresponding with the parents at that time. And so I was indicating in that, in the reports about her, that this was not unheard of, and it's something that I think I get reports of fairly regularly. Every day I get a email or two. I've got a son or daughter of parents who are writing to me about their child and wondering about their special gift and what they should, how can they make that useful and so forth and so on. And in those, I continue to get sporadic reports of these parents who seem reliable reporters to me about this phenomena. Well, then I came across this girl here in Wisconsin, actually. Her father wrote to me and said that this girl had the ability to read her therapist's mind. And by that, he meant that the therapist would be thinking some thought. For example, one of the first things that the therapist, who was so surprised when this happened, but she said, let me test this. And so she said, I'm going to think of the name of my landlord, which Haley had never heard or known about. And she thought of her landlord's name, and Haley types out the landlord's name on the Padlet. And then since that time, they've confirmed this over and over. So that's not something I would ordinarily accept on first blush. So I said, well, let me visit and see what happened or what happens. And so I went there for my first visit, and I've had 3 or 4 visits with her now. And on this first visit, I would give the therapist a card on which I had written the word synesthesia. And the the therapist would look at the card, and Haley would type out SYNT, not looking at the card at all, type out synesthesia. And I was sort of aghast, or whatever word one wants to use. And so I said, well, let's up the ante a little bit. And sometimes when you examine a patient, you'll use a phrase like some neurological patients, I'll say, around the rugged rock, the ragged rascal ran. And so I put that on the card and gave it to the therapist, and ARUNDTHERUGGED. Haley types out that word. So now I didn't make any. I just let them do their thing the way that they do it, and didn't. I decided that I would come back another time and see if the same and the same thing happened. So she does have this capacity, and it's evident to me. I have it videotaped. I have it documented, and now I know that. This would need to be further explored, but I think it should be. And it's a long-winded answer to your question, but do I think that that's real? Do I believe that is happening? And the answer is I do, which is not a place where I ordinarily start.
I think this is the example, isn't it, really, of, you are a trained scientist, you are a trained physician, you are a trained psychiatrist. And as a scientist, you actually use the scientific method whereby you use empirical evidence, you actually test things out in the way that you would ordinarily. And the evidence you see here now, your description there of the spelling of the word synesthesia, effectively to me, that is absolutely impossible by any standard that one could apply. One could say that she was picking up non-verbal cues from from you or from the other lady. But effectively, as far as I'm aware from speaking to Diane, that there is a barrier that is actually put up, so it is very difficult for the young girl to actually pick up any clues. And even if she did, there's one thing actually picking up, body language and such like, and picking up a word like synesthesia, which is the kind of word that a child of that age would probably have no idea of. Now, what very much frustrates me here is that skeptics will turn around and say, because the present scientific paradigm depends upon these things not being true, so therefore they have to come up with some an alternate explanation. Or they fall back on the classic of, the plural of anecdote is not proof. But effectively, these things are witnessed and have been recorded. So there's something powerful here that you have, powerful and paradigm changing. Because effectively what it is telling us is that extrasensory perception exists, and it seems to exist in individuals that are differently abled in some way. And this is the thing that absolutely intrigues me, and I know it's intrigued you all your life. And it gives us the opportunity to move back a little bit, back to your work with Kim Peake. Now, one of the things I've always wanted to ask you when I was given the opportunity is that I have read, and it's either from your work or from other sources, that Kim did not have a corpus callosum. Now, is that true? Was that the case, that he was born in absence of agenesis? He had no corpus callosum. Is that true?
Yes, it is, and that's amply demonstrated on all of the imaging that's done. It's very striking when you look at a normal brain, and then you see this huge structure. The corpus callosum is a large structure, and it's simply absent. And he does not have a corpus callosum. Now, there are, however, some other fibers that make some connection between the hemispheres. It's not entirely the corpus. There's an anterior and a posterior bundle, as it's called, but he does not have a corpus callosum.
But of course, this means in effect that he was a living split brain patient. So the work of Michael Gazzaniga and Roger Sperry and everybody else, where they were reproducing split brain patients. Effectively, Kim was a split brain patient at birth. He was a congenital split brain patient. Now, as far as I'm aware, am I right in thinking that he was also epileptic, or was he just exclusively autistic?
No, he was not. He was not epileptic. He did not have epilepsy.
Okay, so in your considered opinion, do you think that the lack of the corpus callosum was in effect facilitating Kim's extraordinary skills, or do you think that it was just something that we're jumping a conclusion to, that it's not really reasonable to do so?
Well, I think that it is important in his case. However, his central nervous system damage extended beyond the absence of the corpus callosum. What happened when Kim was born, he had an encephalocele, which is a blister or a golf ball sized, ping pong ball sized herniation of the brain actually outside the skull. It's called an encephalocele. But that, in his case, reduced itself. He didn't have to have surgery. But in the process, if you look at his CAT scan, there is an absence of the corpus callosum. There also is left hemisphere damage, and the cerebellum is in about 7 or 8 pieces instead of 1 piece. So the cerebellum, which has its ties to memory as well. So in his case, he has a very unique architecture, certainly based on the damage. Now, and the thing is, absent corpus callosum does occur in other individuals. In fact, there's an association of parents of children who have absent corpus callosum, and not all of them have the kind of ability that Kim does. My feeling is that, for example, it's reported with Kim that he would read one page with one eye and the other page with the other eye, and put that into his hard disk. And I have no reason to doubt that based on the speed and rapidity with which he would read. It's just amazing. And then it would go into his hard drive, and as is. So I think that the corpus callosum, unfortunately, Kim passed away several years ago, but we were just now developing the kind of imaging, the fiber tracking imaging, which is well beyond the CAT scan and well beyond MRI. And it would be interesting to see that the fiber tracking in his case, to see exactly what those connections were. So the absent corpus callosum was certainly, I think, significant, but it was not the only issue in his central nervous system damage.
Did you ever witness yourself any of the extraordinary things that Kim could do?
Well, yeah, he would certainly would look at something and memorize it. Books, for example, would memorize, and it was immediately into his hard drive and could be recalled. The interesting thing about Kim, and in fact all of the savants that I've worked with, is that there's kind of a sequence that when I first met Kim, I was impressed by his extraordinary factual memory. He was a walking encyclopedia, and that he could read a book so quickly and then put it into his hard drive, and that in itself was amazing. But as time went on with Kim, he seemed almost to get a little bored with that and began to improvise. A lot of puns and other kinds of offshoots or improvisations on things that he heard. For example, I asked him, what do you know about Beethoven's Fifth Symphony? And he said, Churchill. And I said, Kim, I don't know. And he said, well, Morse code is ... for the letter V, and Churchill was always sporting his letter V. Or I asked him, what do you know about Lincoln's Gettysburg Address? And he said it was 1410 Front Street. And I said, I don't get it. He said, that's where he stayed the night before he gave his famous speech. So that was his address in Gettysburg. So he began to do these puns and other kinds of witticisms that sometimes I could keep up with and often could not. And his dad sort of became his translator in the sense that he would make the connection but even that often transcended his dad's ability. So Kim went from being amazing recall to some improvisation to really creation of things, and became very creative. And I think if ever there was a super intelligent language, I think Kim represented that, because he would often, sometimes he would explain, he would sort of kindly explain to us what that meant, but sometimes not. And I noticed that in other, that same transition in other savants, from Leslie, a good example, Tchaikovsky's First Piano Concerto. But he gets bored when he'll do that. If you want him to do it, he'll do it back just the way he heard it. But as he continues, it looks like he gets a little bored, and he'll begin to improvise. And finally now he's creating his own songs with his own lyrics, even right on the spot. If you ask Leslie to play a piece that he's never heard, it may not even exist, he'll say, I know that piece, and he'll make it up, and then he'll give it a name and he'll give it the lyrics. So there's this going from replication to improvisation to creation. And Kim was his father wrote down in a little book some of these witticisms, which I have, and they're really remarkable. He was the Mount Everest of memory, but he also was going beyond that into this making these. But at one time was this huge factual memory, became a Google in putting those facts together in unique kinds of ways that I sort of out-thought many of us. So he was a remarkable man, remarkable guy.
Well, because what's intriguing here, isn't it, is that he was making very, very clever, deep puns, where he was finding associations, verbal associations, mathematical associations. And as you rightly say, you know, that many of the kind of puns that are made sometimes can be so obscure that the witness would not necessarily make the links, and it's almost lost because the person's made the pun and they've gone away. I mean, I've seen this happen myself, again, at the organisation I was working for, where children would just cleverly play around with words, and you'd suddenly walk away and you say, no, I see now what point he was making there. And it was profoundly clever, that it was almost a leap of intuition in many, many ways. Now, one of the things that I have read many times, and again, it's one of the things, is trying to get to the facts rather than the reportage of these things, is that Kim's memory was phenomenal and was similar, because I know in your book, and I've mentioned this guy in my books as well, Sherezevsky, the Alexander Lurier's mnemonic guy, from the mind of a mnemonic, and that Kim could do that as well, that he could read a book and he would know the location of the words and everything, and he could actually repeat the book verbatim. Is that true, or is this again one of these stories that have been exaggerated somewhat?
I think that was true. What happened in my experience with Kim over a period of time, I think the first time that I saw him, I was impressed with his ability to recall the passage from the book and the page number of the passage, and it was astounding. I think as he went along, though, his literal memory was not quite as precise as he got into this improvisation and the creation. And the same thing is true of Leslie. Formerly with Leslie, you could play a piece of any complexity and length, and he would play it back perfectly. He's less able to do that now, but I think it's because of this advancement, so to speak, of improvisation and creation. So that with Kim, I think his literal memory was not as precise as it had been, but it was more impressive to me was this ability to go from the factual to the Google, putting those facts together in very creative and sometimes astonishing ways. So I think the literal memory was not quite as precise as it had been, but the substitution of the improvisation and the creation more than made up for that, as far as I'm concerned.
Because I think it's very interesting, again, the way you use the term, the Google analogy, which I think is really quite accurate, isn't it? The idea that the information is being associated and it's being pulled up with links and everything else, and there's been these leaps of information, which suggests that the knowledge has been acquired at some stage in the past, or possibly not. It could be uploaded from somewhere else. And it's then linked immediately. You know, there's no kind of consequential leap where somebody has to think of something, then think of something else. What does that remind me of, and everything else? It doesn't do that. It seems to take a holographic leap, bringing information from one place to another. And I'm intrigued because one of the quotations that I came across that you said in your book is, forgetting, therefore, is not a matter of memory decay, but rather a matter of imperfect access. And the idea that memory, you know, I'm very much aware of the work, I don't know of Carl Pribram, and the idea that memory is distributed across the brain in a holographic way, and that effectively, like the parts of a hologram are parts of the whole, that memory works in a similar way. Now, what's your opinions on that? Because that phrase leapt out at me, and I thought I really need to ask Darold what he means by that, and what has drawn you to that conclusion from the work you've done, not only with Leslie and with Kim, but with your other subjects.
Right. Well, I think that a number of things have propelled me in the direction of better understanding memory and seeing memory in a different kind of way. The first question is, how much do we remember? Do we really remember everything that we've ever experienced or happened? And is there a continuous tape recorder of our life in our brain? And if so, or what might point in that direction? Well, in my earlier practice, I did some sodium amytal interviews, which are hypnosis kinds of things, where I had a patient. She was convinced that something had happened in her life that was very traumatic and produced these anxiety attacks. And she had a sense that it happened, that there was something that took place, but she couldn't quite bring it up. And I said, well, so we used sodium amytal. And it turns out something did happen on a particular day, which she had suppressed, but which was not as traumatic as she thought it might be. But in going to that day, she remembers being in the car. She remembers going by these particular buildings. She remembers the stop and go light changing. So she relived that episode, which consciously she was unable to do. More recently, with Penfield's work, as you know, when he was exploring patients for the epileptogenic focus, would put the probe down on a certain area of the cortex, and my God, it's my third birthday, and there's Aunt Mildred, and and so forth, and a memory which did not have access to. And more recently, some work in trying to do more deep. We're doing more deep brain probing now for Parkinson's disease and other illnesses. And this particular researcher was trying to find perhaps if you could affect the hypothalamus and the appetite center, it might be one way to control morbid obesity. And in putting the probe down, trying to get to the hypothalamus, he had the same experience as Penfield. The person would say, "Oh my God, I haven't thought of that," and it was just there as a very vivid memory, which in a waking state you're not able to recall. But even in my own case, for example, if I had seen a movie in the past, let's say maybe 10 years ago, and have forgotten about the movie, but if by chance that movie came on, I would, oh yeah, I remember that now, and can remember, reasonably vividly. So first of all, I think there is a huge amount of storage of memories for perhaps our whole lives. I don't know. I think the brain is capable of that. Of that kind of storage. But beyond that, I've gotten into I mentioned earlier, my sort of a haunting question of how do savants know things they never learned? And congenital savants that were born that way, like Leslie and others, will seem to have almost an intuitive or instinctual knowledge of the rules of math, or the rules of music, and the rules of art. And there are rules that everybody will sort of agree, but they know that, and they've never been exposed to that. And so I was going along, but then in the last 8 or 10 years, I've run into the acquired savant. And these are people who are ordinary individuals who have a blow to the head, and suddenly are musicians or mathematicians, sometimes at an extremely conspicuous level that was never there before. They had not played the piano before, or they had failed math and never did algebra, maybe did, but now they're drawing fractals like Jason Padgett does. And so the question comes, well, where is that knowledge, or where does that come from? And I guess my feeling is that it is stored, that we all have a reservoir of knowledge to greater or lesser degree. We're not all little Picassos or Michelangelos, but we have these pockets of ability and talent within ourselves. And sometimes a head injury or a dementia or or some other kind of illness. And so these people, just like congenital savants, seem to know things they never learned. And to me, my explanation for that is what I call genetic memory. That is that we not only inherit how tall we are, the color of our hair, or the color of our eyes, we can actually inherit knowledge. And by knowledge, I'm talking about the rules of music. Now, I've written about that and had some things on Scientific American, and the vitriolic response to that by so many people, the nurture-nature argument. Some people will say, give me a child, give me 10,000 hours with this child, and I'll make him into a musician or an artist. It's nurture. And I'm saying, no, that nurture is important, but nature. And we have, I think, within us these not only the storage of memory from the past, but these pockets of information or knowledge. And Lord knows that if you look at DNA, the work of Dr. Church at Harvard and others demonstrate that the capacity of DNA to store is almost infinite. I mean, you can put the Library of Congress into a speck of DNA, so there may be a mechanism. So I've gotten into this the memory. Now, some people say we use only 10% of our brain, and I think that's an overestimate. I think that we probably use less. And I just, I don't know if you saw, just in the last several days, there was a thing on YouTube of this a gentleman who was hydrocephalic and has just a thin cortex of less than 10%, and yet he is a graduate. And he works in high finance. He is an ordinary person with essentially no brain, which tells me about what the capacity of the brain. I simply have become more in awe of that, of the brain and its capacity, and how little we really know about that. And so when I venture into genetic memory or paranormal things, that's not an area I ordinarily would have ventured into. But these cases have simply, they're there, they exist. You can't say they're UFOs or put them somehow. Let's get back to our ordinary thinking and have these as outliers. And I'm saying we can't until we can explain Kim Peake. We can't really explain the brain and brain function. Until we can explain the savant, we can't say we understand the brain. So,
well, absolutely. I mean, there are things there that, for instance, there was research done over here in the UK by a guy called John Lorber, and one of his subjects, all they had was the rim of the cortex around the side of the brain. And his patient had lived a perfectly adequate life. Now, we also have, I saw recently that the Noam Chomsky idea of syntactic structures and the idea that knowledge of language is innate, and that we instinctively know about grammatical structures. So here again, we have evidence that there is something within the DNA, somewhat within genetics, that actually uploads information. Now, in my forthcoming book, I'm going to be expanding on this as far as I possibly can in terms of the neurochemistry of it. And I'm very much interested. As you may know, I've recently written a book with Irvin Laszlo discussing the hypothesis of the Akashic field and the Akashic record, and you can spin off from that into the work of Roger Penrose and Stuart Hamhoff and their theory of orchestrated reduction through the microtubules within the neurons themselves. I'm also aware of the work of a guy called John Joe McFadden, Professor John Joe McFadden, who is a microbiologist at the University of Surrey, just down the road from here, and I've met John Joe a couple of times. And John Joe argues that consciousness itself is actually encased in an electromagnetic field around the neurons. So what we're doing is we're wrongly understanding the brain. And because we are so positioned in terms of a particular worldview and a particular paradigm worldview, we can't break out of it. And to me, this is bad science. And I think both of you and I are in agreement with this, that you can't, if there are outliers, if there are white crows or black swans, one needs to investigate these, because Peake and the little girl that Diane Hennessy Powell and you have been working with, these are telling us something about what the brain is, what reality is. And because we're not even at the first point of explaining David Chalmers' hard problem of consciousness, we need to be looking in these things. We can't just ignore them, because we can't. So we're getting towards the end of the interview now. There's one thing I do, just very quickly. It was something that you were talking about before. Sodium amytal. I'm aware of something called the WADA test, where you can actually switch off the dominant hemisphere of the brain by actually injecting sodium amytal into the carotid artery. Is this what you were doing there? Were you actually using sodium amytal in that way to actually elicit the memories? Because I'm intrigued as to what the mechanism is whereby how it can do that. So just a minute or two, could you explain how that works in principle?
Well, it's simply a chemical hypnosis is what it is. It's putting the patient into a sort of a hypnotic or a subconscious state, except I'm using a chemical instead of using the hypnosis, because it works much more quickly. But so you simply inject the sodium amytal. The patient becomes drowsy, but not. You don't want them to go asleep, and as they get into this twilight area, they simply have recall of things that in their conscious are unable to recall. So it's seemingly affecting both hemispheres rather than just one. But it brings forth things that they simply had repressed or whatever, but it's there.
Because this, again, is interesting, isn't it? The idea that, an earlier guest on this program was Dr. Andreas Mavromatis, who is the world's leading authority on hypnagogic and hypnopompic states. And again, the idea is, isn't it, when you're using sodium amytal, what you're doing is you're eliciting the hypnagogic state, those liminal states between sleeping and awake, where you're probably in an area of REM intrusion or whatever we'd like to call it. And this is where the subliminal memories can suddenly flood back, and we can actually recreate Wilder Penfield's work neurochemically. And it's fascinating, it really is. So to finish off, Darold, what's your next big exercise? What are the things that you're actually taking forward now for the next few years in your work?
Well, right at the moment we're in the process of, I've talked for years that there ought to be a Savant Institute somewhere. There ought to be a place, and there is none in the world, that really looks at Savant Syndrome and all of its ramifications. So we are, and I'm 82 years old, and the time will come where I want my work to continue, but I won't be here to continue it. So we're in the process now of setting up a center, actually here in Wisconsin, to carry on my work and to consolidate my work. I've got videotapes and I've got all this stuff that I want to put together, and so we want to recruit someone to sort of succeed me, and we're in the process of trying to find a neuroscientist who will be able to carry on the work in terms of I have all these cases of Savant Syndrome themselves, and I have these more than several 6 or 7 cases of the ESP paranormal that I'd like to really explore. And these are kids actually who know things they never learned, some of which, by the way, is language and other languages, which it sort of comes into the picture as well. I want to sort of use music, art, and math, but now I'm seeing some of these with other languages. So I guess I've also gotten very involved with hyperlexia, and we don't have time to talk about that. Children who speak late or read early, who are often called autistic, but they are not. They have autistic symptoms, which they outgrow and go on to be very bright individuals. And I have about 200 such cases of those. So I want to continue to explore the areas that that are getting more and more peripheral. I have some concern about venturing much further into telepathy, because whenever I've done that, I get this criticism of he's off the deep end, or that's, whatever happened to Dr. Treffert, and he used to be, reliable and so forth. And so I have some trepidation, but the cases that I've seen, I feel a responsibility to report. Now, I can report the case and can show the tapes and let people come to their own conclusions, but at least to document that this is a real phenomenon. It is happening. So I think I'll probably get a little braver and maybe report some of these cases and let the chips fall where they may with respect to criticism, because I think they are they have tremendous implication. The genetic memory and the reservoir of that within each of us, and how can we tap that without having a stroke or a blow to the head, is a very reasonable question. So those are the areas I'm going to continue to work in and recruit people to help me now, and to carry on some of the work that I haven't had the time to do.
Wow. Well, any help I can do in that respect, I'd be more than willing to be involved, as a huge admirer of your work. And in fact, I will be citing a great deal of your work and Diane's work in my forthcoming book, which will be published both in the UK and in the USA. So anything I can do to help. Now, on that, if any of the listeners here are interested in actually contacting you or knowing more about your work, are there any places they can actually contact you on the web or anything else?
The best way is with email, darold@charter.net. I do have the Savant Syndrome website, which, by the way, I intend to really become more interactive and perhaps a parent and clinician forum with our new center going on. But the best way to contact me is by email. And I'm looking for neuroscientists out there who might be interested in carrying on what we're doing.
Okay, well, thank you very much, Darold. That was absolutely fantastic, and I cannot stress how important your work is, and also just to congratulate you on your scientific honesty in going where the information tells you rather than where the prejudices feel you should go. And I think you're an incredibly brave individual, and I think you should have a round of applause for your strength of character in terms of all this. Right, thanks everybody, and thanks for listening in. Sorry, yes, Darren?
I really appreciate that endorsement and encouragement. I really do. And I think, as I said, I'm going to share the work and let people, come to their own conclusions. But I think it's work that has such profound implications that we can't just sort of ignore it and leave it out there as some kind of an outlier or a UFO kind of thing. Because until we can explain it, I guess that's where I am. Until I can explain that, I can't really just leave it out there. So that's where.
No, absolutely. It's looking for the explanations, isn't it? Right, folks. The next show will be recorded next month when I've got Maggie Latourell. We've had a wonderful sequence of linked interviews here. After Diane Hennessy-Powell and Dr. Darold Treffert, we now have Maggie Latourell, who has recently published a book on Alzheimer's. And in the book on Alzheimer's, Maggie discusses in great detail the amazing telepathic abilities that her mother showed as she slipped into the final stages of Alzheimer's disease. Again, some of this work will feature in my forthcoming book, together with the work that Darold is actually doing as well. So until next month, thank you for listening in, and thank you again, as always, for Dia Nunez over there in what I'm told is a very, very hot Denver. And until next month, and until you're checking in again, my thanks again. My thanks again to my very special guest, Darold.
Thank you.